Have you ever witnessed a moment so profoundly cruel that your brain simply refuses to process it at first? You just stand there, blinking, waiting for the punchline, waiting for someone to laugh and say it was all a terrible joke. That is exactly where my story begins. My name is Joanna, and I am 31 years old. It was 5:14 inches the morning, and I was standing at gate B17 inside the McGee-Tyson Airport in Knoxville, Tennessee. The air was that specific kind of December cold, the kind that still clings to your bones even after you walk into the heated terminal. Beside me stood my grandmother, Hazel. She had both of her frail, wrinkled hands wrapped tightly around the handle of a battered brown leather suitcase. It was an old piece of luggage that used to belong to my grandfather, Earl, patched together with duct tape from a trip they took to Gatlinburg way back in 1994. Scattered all around, the two of us were 11 members of my family. They were doing normal airport things, checking their boarding passes, adjusting their carry-on bags, mindlessly scrolling through their phones. We were all supposed to be embarking on the trip of a lifetime. A 3-week lavish vacation through Europe, Rome, Florence, Paris, and London. Then my dad, Richard, turned to my grandmother. He didn't even bother to lower his voice. He looked her right in the eyes and said, "Mom, I forgot to book your ticket. Just go home." Before we get to the absolute fallout of that morning and the dark, twisted rabbit hole of family secrets it forced me to uncover, I want to welcome you to the channel. If you appreciate true stories about real life, family drama, and the kind of quiet strength that changes everything, please do me a quick favor, hit that like button, leave a comment down below, and make sure you subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And it lets me know you want more stories exactly like this one. To truly understand the gravity of what happened at gate B17, you have to understand who my grandmother is. Hazel is the kind of woman who built her entire life on discipline and routine. She taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school for 34 years before retiring at the age of 65. She raised 2 children completely on her own, my dad, Richard, and my aunt, Diane. After my grandfather, Earl, passed away from lung cancer 18 years ago, she never remarried. She never even dated. She always used to say that Earl was the only man stubborn enough to love her right. She still lived in the exact same 3-bedroom ranch house that Earl bought for them in 1981, situated on a quiet street about 45 minutes south of Knoxville. My grandmother is the kind of person who wraps birthday presents in old newspaper because she thinks buying wrapping paper is a frivolous waste of money. She irons her cloth napkins. If you send her a gift, you are guaranteed to get a handwritten thank you card in the mail that very same day. And above all else, she saved. For 22 years, she pinched every spare penny because she firmly believed that leaving a legacy, leaving something behind for her family, was the most important thing she could ever do in her life. But leading up to this trip, I had started to notice that her house was looking a little different. The porch railing outside was loose and wobbly. The gutters were visibly sagging, heavy with debris. Inside, the kitchen faucet had a persistent drip, so bad that she kept a plastic bowl in the sink overnight just to catch the water. Even though it was December, her thermostat was set incredibly low. And she was constantly wearing the same 3 heavy sweaters in rotation. When I asked her about it, she just brushed it off, saying she preferred the sweaters. When I brought it up to my dad, who was the one actively managing all of her finances, he casually brushed me off too. He said, "Mom's fine. She just doesn't like spending money." He assured me he was checking in on her every other week and that everything was handled. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was her son. He was my dad. The whole idea for the Europe trip had started a month earlier at our family Thanksgiving dinner. There were 12 of us gathered around my grandmother's dining room table, passing around turkey, cornbread dressing, and green bean casserole. My dad stood up at the head of the table, raised his glass, and made a massive announcement. He said he had been working on something for the family 3 weeks in Europe, all of us together. The table practically erupted. My Aunt Diane's kids immediately pulled out their phones to look up pictures of the Colosseum. My stepmom, Brenda, started loudly talking about all the designer shopping she was going to do in Paris. My grandmother just sat at the end of the table. Her eyes were so bright. She gently set down her fork, pressed both of her hands flat onto the tablecloth, and quietly said, "I have never left this country. Your grandpa always said we would see Paris someday." My dad then explained the cost. He said each household would contribute their fair share for the flights, the hotels, and the ground transport, coming out to roughly $65. 000 total for the 12 of us. Then he looked right at his mother. "Mom, your share would be about $30. 000 from your retirement fund. If you want to come." She didn't even hesitate. She looked at him and said, "I am 74 years old. If not now, when?" That very weekend, she wrote him a check for $30. Ling, ling, ling. That money came straight from the account she had meticulously built over 2 decades. She was so excited that she pulled Earl's old leather suitcase out of the hallway closet weeks early and began packing. She laid her passport on top of her folded clothes like it was a sacred artifact. Fast forward to that freezing December morning at the airport. We all dragged our luggage to the check-in counter. The agent started calling off the names and printing the boarding passes one by one. Richard, Brenda, Diane, Greg, the kids, me. Then it was Hazel's turn. The gate agent typed on her keyboard. She paused. She typed again. Then she looked up and said the words that made my stomach drop. "I don't have a reservation under that name." My grandmother, confused, opened up her plastic boarding pass holder. Inside was a printed itinerary that my dad had given her. It had the dates, the cities, the hotel names, but it had no booking reference number, no confirmation code, no actual airline ticket. She looked up at my dad. He barely even glanced at her. He just shrugged his shoulders and casually said, "Mom, I must have forgotten to book yours. I'm so sorry. Just go home. We'll FaceTime you from Rome." He delivered the news the exact same way you would tell someone you need to cancel a lunch date or that the grocery store is closed. And the worst part, nobody else in the family said a single word. My Aunt Diane just looked away. Brenda, my stepmom, casually adjusted her scarf. Greg studied the departure board. Not one person out of 11 said, "Wait, we can fix this." Not one person mentioned the fact that she had paid $30,000 for this trip. The gate agent stared at us in shock. An elderly couple waiting in line behind us exchanged a disgusted look. My grandmother didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her hands were trembling violently, but her facial expression never changed. She just quietly closed the empty boarding pass holder and put it back inside her purse. As my dad grabbed his bag to head toward the security checkpoint, I caught a glimpse of his luggage tag. It read business class. All 11 of them started walking away. Not one of them turned around to look back. My grandmother just stood there under the buzzing overhead lights, a tiny 7'4" woman leaning on a cane, holding her dead husband's suitcase, utterly abandoned by the people she gave her life to. I looked down at the boarding pass in my right hand. Then I looked at her. Without a second thought, I ripped my ticket straight down the middle. My dad heard the sound and turned around. "Joe, what are you doing?" he asked, suddenly annoyed. "I'm going home with Grandma." I said, "My Aunt Diane stopped walking. Don't be dramatic." She scoffed. And then Brenda, without even bothering to turn around, threw the final dagger. "Your grandma wouldn't enjoy Europe anyway. She can barely walk." I walked over to my grandmother and picked up Earl's suitcase. It was incredibly heavy. She had packed for 3 entire weeks, all her clothes, her reading glasses, her Bible, and the little bag of butterscotch candy she always kept with her. We walked out to the parking lot together. The automatic doors slid shut behind us, and no one followed. As we stepped back out into the sharp winter air, Hazel reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were thin and freezing cold. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, I did." I told her. We drove back to her house in complete silence. When we got inside, she sat down in Earl's old armchair and just stared blankly at the wall. I offered her tea, but she didn't want any. That night, I slept in her spare bedroom. The mattress was thin. The air was freezing, and the furnace rattled violently every 20 minutes. I just lay there in the dark, counting the hours, thinking about what my father had just done and realizing that I was going to have to do something about it. When I woke up the next morning at 6:30, I walked into the kitchen. Hazel had already combed her hair, put on her slippers, and was standing at the stove. She was making eggs in a heavy cast iron skillet that Earl had bought at a flea market in 1973. She looked at me and said, 50 years, and it still cooks better than anything. But as I sat at the table and really looked around, my professional instincts kicked in. I work as a nurse in geriatric care. 7 years in that field had taught me to notice the things that are missing before I notice the things that are wrong. The refrigerator was practically empty, just eggs, half a gallon of milk, butter, and a jar of pickles. Lined up on the counter were her medicine bottles. And I recognized right away that they were all cheap, generic brands for blood pressure and joint inflammation, not the name brand medication she used to take. I glanced at the wall. The thermostat was set to 62 degrees. "Grandma," I asked carefully, "when's the last time Dad came by?" She cracked an egg into the pan. "Oh," he checks on me, picks up the mail. He says it's easier. Something about identity theft. After breakfast. I walked over to the front door and looked inside the mail basket. It was crammed full of junk mail catalogs, a Bed Bath & Beyond flyer, a lawn care advertisement from 2023. But there was absolutely nothing important, no bank statements, no letters from Social Security, not a single financial document. Later that afternoon, Hazel's next door neighbor, Loretta, came over. Loretta was a retired county clerk, the kind of woman who noticed absolutely everything happening on her street, but never gossiped unless you directly asked her. Since Hazel was taking a nap, exhausted by a sorrow that went far deeper than a lack of sleep, I took the opportunity to ask Loretta what she had seen. We sat out on the porch. Loretta kept her voice low. I've been worried about Hazel. She told me she used to go to Cracker Barrel every Friday with the church ladies. Stopped about 2 years ago. Said she couldn't afford it. That made no sense. Loretta shook her head. And your daddy comes by every other Tuesday. He takes the mail from the box before Hazel even gets up. I see him from my kitchen window. He never goes inside. He just grabs the mail, gets back in his truck, and leaves. My chest tightened. That night, I decided to call Hazel's bank. I identified myself as her granddaughter and asked for basic account information. The representative on the phone stopped me immediately. I'm sorry. Ma'am, you are not an authorized party on this account. The authorized signer is Richard Farrell. I went straight to the spare bedroom, where Hazel kept an old, dented beige filing cabinet with masking tape labels. I opened the drawer labeled personal. Behind a stack of old Christmas cards and copies of Earl's obituary. I found it. It was a 6-page document, heavily notarized, dated 5 years ago. A durable power of attorney. It granted my father, Richard Allen Farrell, full financial authority over every single account, asset, and legal affair belonging to Hazel May Farrell. Hazel appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed. He said, "It was just in case something happened to me," she said softly. So he could pay my bills if I couldn't. I read through the document. The language was sweeping and absolute. It gave him access to her bank accounts, authority to redirect her mail, authority to change her life insurance beneficiaries, and the power to make withdrawals at his own discretion. Grandma, do you know your account balances? I asked. She shook her head. Richard handles that. He says, I have plenty. If you are watching this video and you have an aging parent or grandparent, I need you to pause right now and ask yourself a question. Do you know who has power of attorney over them? Do they know their own bank account balances? Can they log into their own accounts? Do not wait. Do not just assume someone else is handling it properly. Ask the questions. Because by the time you notice something is wrong, the damage has usually already been done. The next day, I called my nursing supervisor, asked for a week of paid leave, and took Hazel directly to the local branch of the community bank she had used for over 30 years. We sat down across from the branch manager, a woman named Tina. What Tina showed us on her computer screen made my hands physically shake. And let me tell you, working in a hospital, I am not someone whose hands shake easily. Tina looked visibly uncomfortable as she pulled up the records. Mrs. Farrell, she said gently, your primary retirement savings account had a balance of $212, 000 as of 5 years ago. She slowly turned her monitor around so we could see the screen. Your current balance is $41. Low bay. Hazel leaned forward, her brow furrowed. That can't be right. Tina printed out the complete transaction history. It was 5 years of relentless, systematic withdrawals. 7 yuan. 000 here. 5 yuan. 000 there. There was a $12 000 withdrawal labeled home repairs in March of 2022, which happened to be the exact same year Hazel's gutters had started sagging. There was an $8 000 withdrawal for medical expenses during a month when Hazel's Medicare had covered every single bill she had. And then I saw the killing blow. The money for the Europe trip, a $30 000 withdrawal made 8 weeks ago, simply labeled travel fund over $140. 000 was gone. Every single transaction had been authorized by one name, Richard Farrell. My grandmother just sat there in the vinyl chair. She picked up the printout, read it once, folded it in half, then rounded it into quarters. She opened her purse and quietly slid the papers right next to her empty. Useless boarding pass holder. She didn't cry. She just sat perfectly still, processing the fact that her own flesh and blood had robbed her blind. When we got back to the house, she stood in the kitchen and said, "I saved that money for 22 years. I used to calculate it every New Year's Eve. I was proud of that number." She looked at me, her eyes heavy with grief. "I trusted him because he is my son. I didn't check because I believed a mother shouldn't have to check on her own child." That night, after she went to bed, I opened up the old Dell desktop computer in her spare room. My dad had set up a shared family email hub years ago to handle household correspondence and travel bookings. Hazel didn't know the password, but she didn't need to. The browser was still logged in. I started digging. I checked the sent folder and found an email thread from 3 months before the trip. The subject line read, "Trip Logistics." It was an email from my dad to my Aunt Diane. The second paragraph made me feel physically sick. It read, "Don't book mom's ticket. Tell her we'll handle it. She won't even notice the money's gone." Attached below, that was a forwarded confirmation to a travel agent. My dad had used Hazel's savings account to upgrade himself. My stepmom, Brenda, and my Aunt Diane to business class seats. The cost of those upgrades was exactly $4, $200 apiece. They were currently touring Europe, sleeping in luxury hotels and sipping fine wine, all funded by the retirement savings of the mother they had deliberately abandoned at the airport. The itinerary he had handed her wasn't a mistake. It was a carefully crafted fake. He didn't forget her ticket. He never intended to buy one. I plugged in a USB drive and downloaded every single piece of evidence. The next morning, we walked into the office of Marcus Webb, the sharpest elder law attorney in East Tennessee. Marcus took one look at the bank statements, the POA, and the emails, and immediately laid out a battle plan. He filed an emergency petition to revoke the power of attorney. He filed a temporary restraining order on all of Hazel's bank accounts. He also discovered that 18 months prior, my dad had secretly changed the sole beneficiary of Hazel's life insurance policy to himself. We changed that back to within 48 hours. The trap was set. Hazel was reinstated as the sole authorized party on her accounts, and they were completely frozen to the outside world. Over in Italy, the dominoes started to fall. On day 11 of their trip, my dad's credit card, which was linked directly to Hazel's account, was violently declined in Venice. He started desperately texting Hazel, asking her to call the bank. She threw her phone in a junk drawer. Then he called me, demanding to know what was going on. I played dumb. I let the silence hang on the line until he got frustrated and hung up. Finally, realizing his free ride was over, he texted me that he was cutting the trip short and flying home early to fix the bank issue. He had no idea what was waiting for him. On day 17, Richard's truck aggressively pulled into Hazel's driveway. He stormed through the front door, unshaven and exhausted. "Mom, we need to talk about the bank." He demanded, instead of an empty house, he walked into the dining room. Waiting for him was me, my grandmother, and an incredibly thick binder of evidence sitting on the table. "What did you do?" "Joanna," he snapped at me. "Her finances are my responsibility. Grandma's finances are Grandma's responsibility." I shot back, and she is right here. Hazel walked into the room. She wasn't shaking anymore. She looked at him with an absolute terrifying calm. She ordered him to sit down. I told him that Grandma wanted to review her accounts and asked if he could walk us through his withdrawals. He instantly puffed up his chest. "I don't have to explain anything. I have power of attorney." I looked him dead in the eye. "Your power of attorney has been suspended pending judicial review." The color drained from his face instantly. He stood up so fast, his chair scraped violently across the floor. He started yelling, trying to claim he was managing the money, moving it for better interest rates. He begged Hazel to stop the madness. Hazel just looked at him and said, "I understand that I had $212. 5 years ago. And now I have $41. Ling, ling, ling." My dad stormed out of the house that day, but he couldn't outrun what he had done. When the rest of the family, Diane and Brenda included, flew back a few days later, Marcus Webb arranged for a formal meeting right there in my grandmother's dining room, the exact same room where my dad had proudly announced the Europe trip 10 months prior. It was the most brilliant, satisfying execution of justice I have ever witnessed. Marcus sat at the head of the table. He systematically laid out the bank statements year by year. He forced Diane to look at the $25,000 transfer my dad had sent to her personal account for her home renovation. He pulled out the fake airport itinerary and laid it side by side with the business class upgrade receipts. Then Marcus pulled out the emails. He read my dad's own words out loud to the room. "Don't book Mom's ticket. Tell her we'll handle it. She won't even notice the money's gone." The room was so quiet you could hear the wall clock ticking. My dad tried to scramble. He tried to claim he was protecting her, that the money was going to waste. That is when Hazel finally spoke up. She placed her hands flat on the table, leaned forward, and delivered a masterclass in dignity. "I saved that money for 22 years. She said, her voice completely steady, every paycheck. "Every summer, I did not take a vacation. I signed that paper because you said you wanted to help. And I believed you because you are my son." She looked right through him. "What you did to me at that airport in front of our entire family, that is the moment I stopped trusting you. You told me you forgot my ticket. You did not forget anything. You just thought I would not matter enough for anyone to stay. She reached out and took my hand, but someone stayed. My dad was speechless. Diane tried to quietly apologize. Hazel just looked at her and said, I will believe that when you return the $25, ling, 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 Diane. The aftermath of that meeting was swift and absolute. 2 months later, the court ruled my dad's power of attorney was permanently revoked. The judge ordered him to repay the entire $140, 000, through a highly structured payment plan, slapping a heavy lien on his personal assets to ensure he couldn't escape it. Diane was forced to return her $25. Ling, ling. Adult Protective Services fully substantiated the investigation, meaning my dad's name is now officially flagged for elder financial exploitation. He was forced to sell his boat and his timeshare just to make the first penalty payment. And he and Brenda had to downsize to a much smaller house. They haven't spoken to me since. And honestly, I prefer it that way. As for Hazel, her life looks vastly different now. Her house has new gutters and a sturdy new porch railing. The leaky kitchen faucet is fixed. She sets her thermostat to a comfortable 72 degrees, and her refrigerator is constantly stocked with good food. She is back to going to Cracker Barrel every Friday with the church ladies. Loretta, the neighbor who helped me figure it all out, says Hazel looks 10 years younger. Hazel says she feels 10 years younger. It turns out that betrayal ages you, but taking back the truth restores your youth. Next October, Hazel and I are taking a trip together. If you open up Earl's old leather suitcase sitting in her hallway closet, you will find 2 very real, fully paid for plane tickets to Paris. She told me she wants to see the Eiffel Tower at night because Earl always used to tell her it looked like it was breathing. People often tell me that what I did at the airport was brave. I don't see it that way. I think walking away with the rest of the family would have been easy. Staying behind, that was just what was right. If there is a life lesson to be taken from all of this, it's this. If you are watching an elderly loved one slowly retreat into their shell, if you notice them suddenly living far below their means, or if things just don't seem quite right with the family member who is handling everything, do not ignore your gut. Trust your instincts. Ask the hard, uncomfortable questions. The people who are exploiting them are banking entirely on your silence. Break the silence. Be the person who stays at the gate. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, or if you believe in standing up for the people who took care of us, please drop a like on this video. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true stories just like this one. I will see you in the next video. Stay safe and take care of your people.